Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and Creative Assembly have just released a brand new ebook for Shadows of Change, this time focusing around Mother Ostankya. This means that it's brand new lore and the book is titled Things in the Wood. I want to read over it and yeah, let's discuss anything that might pop up because, well, you know, this is brand new lore. It's by David Guymer. I'm a big fan of this author. This is also the same author that wrote the Yuan Bo ebook, so yeah, it's going to be super cool. If you want to read it for yourself, it can be found in Total War Access. I'll have a link to that in the description below. Three grim-faced men glanced up from the fire. They were shabbily dressed horse nomads, long leather tunics with fur sleeves and collars, strung with warding herbs and tokens, baggy trousers, rawhide belts, cone-shaped bashlik with woolly flaps obscuring their faces. Two of the three wore short sablers, light cavalry blades with a single curved edge and plain S-shaped hilts. The third sat with a large birdish axe across his lap, running a whetstone around the curve of the blade. Three unstrung bow staves stood against three nearby trees. The fire had been prepared using pine cones, twigs, and bricks of dried animal dung. Its smoke was almost a fourth man around the fire, burlesque and pungent, thinking itself unnoticed amongst the bowing snow-coated spruces and pines. The three, or the four, looked taken aback by Radig Brengi's sudden pine-thrashed appearance at the edge of their clearing. The axemen glanced at Radig's pony before shrugging and looking away. "Blessings of Daz, stranger." Lowering his whetstone, Axe offered up a wooden bowl piled with moist strips of venison, carved from the small buck roasting over the fire on a split. Radig felt his mouth fill with saliva and his empty stomach churn. How long had it been since he had last eaten? Days, was it? It felt like weeks. His mad flight through the woods was a blur now. Overcome by the scent of venison, he urged his mount out from the trees and into the clearing, but she refused. Kazia was a shaggy oblast pony of some 13 hands, with a low barrel, stocky legs, and a large, restless head. Her black mane had been pleated and woven with yellow string. Her hooves were untrimmed and unshod, almost like claws. She ground the cold iron bit between her teeth and snorted, her breath clotting in the cold night air. Like all the best horses, Kazia was more than half wild, left to roam the sea of grass east of Korochev, burrowing for forage in snow, shivering through the dark winter months, called back and pampered only when the Druzina had need of horses. Although small compared to the gigantic war horses favoured in the southern realms, she would run for days without complaint, covering more ground and faster than any of the horses of the Empire. She was crafty and stubborn, and knew her mind better than any man who might ride her. She knew when something felt right, and when it felt wrong. She blew restlessly. Her sides were lathered with sweat and melted snow. She had been galloping hard. Radig could feel her heart pounding against the knees where they sat against her ribs. His own cheek stung where a branch had clawed him. Something had been chasing them through the woods, but in his panic, he must have failed to see it, because he could not remember what it had been, or why it had been pursuing him. He shook his head to clear it of its confusion. "Who are you?" Radig asked the three men. He was not minded to trust three strangers in the wood, however fine their supper smelled. For all he knew, they were woodland fae, and he could be next on their spit. "What are you doing in the woods?" Axe shrugged. "We live in these woods." Alright, so first page, not a lot happens. It's really much just bringing in the characters. It's really cool. Honestly, this is better than what we've seen already from Lords of the Lands. It's great introductions. It talks about how the horses of Kislev are generally heartier and stronger than those of the Empire, and it's kind of nice to see a mention of Daz once again, considering that he is considered one of the important deities in Kislev, and it's a shame that we don't really have too much representation of him just yet. "Have done since we were children," said the second man, the smallest of the three, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What are you doing here?" Radig hesitated. A memory assailed him. Teeth and claws, screaming faces, red droplets sprayed across the scaly white bark of a spruce. Kazia winning as the trees around them opened red slit eyes and sprouted horns. He shuddered and the memory passed. "I'm looking for a way out of the forest, to Korochev." Yes, that was it. He had been trying to find his way home. He had entered the wood and lost his way, and the same memory threatened to resurface. He stared into the stranger's fire until it retreated. The stream. Yes, I. He trailed off. Axe gave him an encouraging grin, again proffering the bowl of venison. Kezia pawed the ground and gave a warning snort, but this time it was Radig's turn to refuse her. He was exhausted, starving, soaked through and shivering. The smell of roasting deer was just too appetizing to resist any longer. I have nothing to give in return, he said. I shot a rabbit and gathered a bushel of sticks for firewood, but Another memory threatened to show itself, but this one only teased, whiskering past the ankle of his consciousness before scurrying off into his mind's shadows. But I left them for Mother Ostankya. The three men signed themselves to ward off the evil eye. The fire guttered, pulled at by a breeze that Radig, in spite of his sodden clothes, did not feel. It is a good man who remembers the mother, said Whisper. A wise one who shows it, said Axe. The third man, as hairy and sullen as a drowsing bear under his mound of wool, felt and fur, stared into the fire and did not speak. It is of no matter, Axe declared suddenly, shaking off the disquiet. No Kislevite should turn a horse archer from his camp. Whisper merely grunted. Kezia whickered and again tried to pull away. Crunching the snow packed into the frozen creases of his coat, Radig dismounted. He was obviously warier than he had realized, because the drop to the ground was longer than he expected. Stumbling like a man who had just fallen out of bed, Radig tossed the pony's reins over a branch, then walked to the fire in the middle of the little clearing. Sleet mizzled through the gaps between the trees. The twin moons fumed down on them all, the wind tearing at their silver hollows. The men did not seem troubled by the rain. Radig sat down between Axe and Whisper and took the offered bowl, stuffing a fistful of venison into his mouth and swallowing without chewing. Still gagging on it, tears in his eyes, he scooped out the remaining contents of the bowl and forced it into his mouth. His eyes closed in bliss. The meat was every bit as delicious as it smelled. So, again, more world building, especially trying to show that even the Kislevites are scared of Mother Ostankya, and that animals are usually a good judge of what is going on. They can sense it. Right then, Radig could not have cared who these men were, or what they were doing in the woods. He would have betrayed his Druzina and given them his horse if they had asked him for it. A new friend at our campfire calls for a song, I think, said Axe. Or a story, said Whisper. Yes, a story for your meal, stranger. He lifted a pot of kvass that had been warming over the fire and poured a stiff measure into a misshapen wooden cup. Radig took the offered cup and gulped it down. He coughed as the fiery spirit chased the meat down his throat. What would you like to hear? A story we have not heard before, Axe smiled, his teeth appearing yellow and crooked in the firelight, and offered to top up Radig's bowl. Radig accepted the freshly carved meat gladly. Tell us a story of Mother Ostankya, said Whisper. Yes, said Axe, and slammed a brawny palm across his thigh. A tale of the Witch of Kislev. Dark knights should have dark tales for their companions. The silent man, as appeared to be his custom, said nothing. Very well, said Radig, relaxing back onto the neatly folded horse blanket and looking into the fire. I know a story of the Hag Mother, and it is all the more horrifying for being true. It's going to be like a ghost story type of situation for this book, I imagine, and it kind of makes sense. She's a folklore type of character. She exists, she's very much real, but even in Kislev they still see her as something otherworldly. I was told this tale by an old Kossar from Sidirna, a stancia far to the east where the great Durkis forest folds before the World's Edge Mountains. I have never been there, nor he to Korochev. For all that, the same river that gallops past my village as a stallion begins its life as a stumbling fall in Shidirna. We were in Volksgrad to face the Kazakh, the Northman raids that came through the high pass that year with the spring floods. His name was Yuli. He had a coat of silver mail and an axe with golden lettering that he claimed to have been written by dwarfs, and a white cloak that had once belonged to a king amongst bears. Or so I believed. I wonder sometimes what became of him after we rode from Volksgrad, for I never saw him again. But he's surely dead now. He was white-haired even then, hard as a piece of wood, and with 3 lifetimes of stories. I had not known until then that the Hag Mother is revered beyond the woods of Korochev, and not only in forests, but in wetlands and mountains, in rivers, and on the open steppe. The stories change from place to place. In Korochev, she lives in a hut woven from witchwood and black thorn. A man can find it, we are told, by following the foul scent of smoke rising from her chimney, for it never stands in the same place twice. In Chernozavtra, beyond the high pass, she lives on the underside of a black lily pad that appears on the Sapadreka River, only when the Chaos Moon is full. Should the black lily pass Chernozavtra, west to the east, then the Stancia can sleep soundly, but if it should pass east to west against the river's normal flow, then the Chernozavtra pulk had best steel itself, for doom rides south from the Chaos Wastes. At such times, the Ataman makes sacrifices to the river in hopes of flattering the Hag Mother into lending Chernozavtra her magic and her armies. In Sidovsk, she is known as the Black Witch of the Crags. Her house is carried in the claws of a frostworm that she bound to her service through her infamous trickery, and to whom, once every 10 years, she feeds the prettiest girl in Sidovsk. Wherever a man can sit upon his horse and see neither church spires nor city walls, that is the land of the Hag Mother, the Witch of Kislev, the power the motherland turns to when its need is great and all others fail. Anyway, Yuli claimed to once have belonged to the polk of the renowned Golden Knight. Not the champion living in the Bokar Palace now, of course, but the one who wore the golden armor before her. Yuli was an old man when I met him, and this was some time ago. They say that Naryaska Lesa is already a greater warrior than her father in his prime. I do not know if this is true, only that any knight entrusted by the Tsar or the Tsarina to be their sword must be great indeed. Yuli's services to the Golden Knight brought him to the Ropsals, a region of densely wooded highlands in the eastern oblast, and a small village called Struziv. It was a 20-day ride through the tangled woodland and over jagged hills to find the bulk of the March Boya in Volsgrad, half that, perhaps, for a lone rider on a determined horse to make the nearest stanza of note in Chagev, provided Urson kept his claws sheathed, the valleys clear of snow. The Golden Knight arrived in Struziv to much fanfare to deal with a bray herd that had been raiding from the Ropsals. The hetman wished to flee, for villages like Struziv are not built to be defended. They are quick to burn and quick to rebuild. The villagers could live in the wind for a season or two, and let the Tsar winter deal with the Dark Ones, but the Golden Knight forbade him. Alright, so what we're getting here is that Mother Ostankya's power is deeply rooted towards the motherland itself and the supernatural force that is Kislev. So this is actually pretty interesting. Again, something that we knew from previous lore with Baba Yaga, but maybe pushing it into a bit of more of a stronger sense. We're also getting a little bit of information regarding the Golden Knight and the one before, so it's pretty interesting to see this lore come into fruition, mostly because, again, it's giving us more context on previous timelines that we won't visit. He vowed to hold Struziv, come what may, and to make the beastmen suffer for their encroachment into the blessed motherland. And so the Polk fought. Each day at nightfall, the bray herds surged from the hills. Men, furred like dogs, and with the heads of goats, and rams bearing primitive spears, and with human skins stretched across their wooden shields. Chariots drawn by foul, horned-headed swine, minotaurs with the strength of 12 men, twisted harpies from the high places, descending on the village in such screeching flocks that they outnumbered the arrows in Struziv twice over. They all met the Golden Knight's sword, and each day when the sun rose, it was over fields littered with the Dark One's misshapen corpses. But each battle became harder than the last. Their strength dwindled, even as that of the Dark Ones seemed to swell. The Golden Knight sought to inspire the defenders of Struziv with his own example, but even his own corsairs began to doubt they could prevail. Many fled. Yuli confessed that he would have been one of them had his Rotamaster not anticipated his intention and confiscated his horse. On the eve of what was to be the final battle, the Golden Knight gave a thundering speech, reminding them of the tenacity and courage they had already shown and promising all who stood by him that Kislev would come if they only held their faith. It was a good speech, but few were heartened by it. They were resigned to death and meant to face it with Kislevite disdain. But that night, against all expectation, Kislev did come. Not from the south, where the Golden Knight had commanded his folk to look for it, but from the north, from the same wild hills that harboured their foes. The winds turned bitter, then died away altogether. A fog rose to fill that stillness. The long valley, crammed with braying gores working themselves up for their next assault, became an eerie lake. Cracked horns and rusted spear tips bobbing over the grey mist like dead leaves. The defenders of Struzev fell silent. Even hardened warriors like Yuli felt their blood running cold. The laughter of crows descended on the village, a handful at first, then hundreds, then thousands. The sky turning black with them, scuffling like Empire soldiers for the last seats in a Kazmaz. Men and women looked in horror. Over a matter of minutes, every roof, fence and wagon in Struzev became crowded by an army of ragged birds, all of them speaking at once, the way that birds sometimes will, when they know something that earthbound creatures like us do not. There was not a man in Struzev who doubted they had come to watch a slaughter, and that was when Ostankya came. She stood alone on the far hillside, so old and ugly that not even the beast dared to approach her. Hunchbacked, wrinkled like a poisonous nut, small tusks like those of a pig protruded from her lower lip. Tatty homespun clothes draped her crooked shoulders. She carried a staff stung with charms and topped with animal skulls. A crown of filthy antlers sat atop her head, like a wart on an old woman's lip. In her other hand she held a wooden ladle. With it she stirred an iron cauldron, bringing forth more of the same fog that had already filled the entire valley and a tattered witching light. "Run, naughty children, and hide from your mother," she cackled over her cauldron. Her lispy voice rang from the hills in both Gospodorian and the dark tongue of the beasts, so that Yuli, which never knew for certain of which of them she condemned. We'll continue with the paragraph as we jump into the next page. They're making her very reminiscent of other characters that we've actually seen in the lore before. This would be the White Dwarf or the Green Knights. She comes at the desperate time of need. She's incredibly powerful. It's a trope that they've used before. It's not a bad thing considering how large the Warhammer fantasy world is. And obviously her origins will likely be very different to the both, as both of them are already quite different. But it's quite interesting to see her appear out of nowhere. It's curious, actually. It's something that I guess will probably be explained when we get an eventual Kislev army book for Warhammer the Old World, because that should go into details regarding all these matters. At least I hope so. But we'll continue, and by the way, do keep in mind that some of these pages obviously do not have any lore, they're just literally just images. But yeah, she's boiling up vengeance that's hotter than coal, and sending her spirits to tear out your soul. The light from the cauldron guttered and dimmed. The fog thickened, obscuring all but the tallest of the beastmen's standards. It rolled on up the valley, all the way towards Struzev, and the defenders cried out as they fell back from it, much to the mirth of the watching crows. A spear's throw from the village boundary, it halted and recoiled, like a flooded river hitting a stone wall. Muffled cries, like the bleating of lost sheep, reached the men where they reformed their lines inside the village. Things moved within the fog. Dark, terrible things. The sort of things that, I am told, could almost make a man feel pity for the Dark Ones. The Golden Knight, more afraid of that mist than he had ever been of the Beastmen, plunged his sword into the hard ground and prayed. To Ursun, the Father Bear, for protection. To Tyr for victory, to Daz for the sunrise. When at last the sun god granted that plea, the fog withdrew from the battlefield to leave no evidence that a battle had ever been fought. Not a single body was left behind, be it of man or of beast, and the terrible fate that awaited them in Ostankya's cauldron was something that Yuli would dare not dwell on. The hag, too, vanished with the dawn. Only a single crow remained, stubbornly perched on the crossbar of the Golden Knight's banner, and refusing to let go of it, however roughly it was shaken. "Run, naughty children," the bannerman would swear he heard it say, but when there was no one but him to hear it. The Golden Knight broke up his polk and left Struziv soon after. The Rotors went on their way to their own homes, while he and his retinue galloped for the Bokar Palace to declare their victory. But those who had been there, men like Yuli, knew that the real victory was Ostankya's. Okay, so what I'm gathering here is that the fog itself was using the thing in the woods, right? It's just kind of hinting at that there. And it's very likely if the Golden Knight did not pray, then a lot of the people there would have been caught in the crossfire, because those types of creatures are chaotic in nature. They are supposed to be chaos creatures. So yeah, anything kind of caught in dies. We've actually all kind of seen films about this. They've got that similar thing to like lots of 90s films like The Mist and so on. Radek felt his eyelids droop. He was unsure how long he had spent in the saddle before finding this place. And between the hot food in his belly and the thickly smoking fire against his body, he was starting to feel warm. He had pulled off his gloves, his sheepskin hat, and loosened the fastenings of his coat. His boots steamed by the fire. The occasional spat of drizzle wet the back of his head, but it was a pleasant feeling, soothing, like the fingers of a parent through a drowsy child's hair. The three woodsmen had fallen silent while Radek told his story. Axe had taken up his axe and resumed work with the whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of stone over iron murmured through the smoke, charming spruce and pine to deeper slumber. "Do you call that horrifying?" said Whisper after a time. He sounded offended. His wet skin glistened from beneath the flaps of his hat as he turned towards Radek and caught the firelight. A few blonde wisps, like a boy's first beard, crisp in the earthly smoke from the fire. "The hag in your tale saved the entire village." "Is that how you think of her?" said Axe, more mildly, still working his blade. "A kindly spirit, a guardian of the wood." "Kindly, no, but a guardian, yes. I would say that she is that. She is cruel as a mother must be cruel, because this is no world for softness. Children must be hard enough inside and out to endure a cold winter, and to hold a spear when the Kazakh come through the mountains. This is how she cares for the motherland. You don't believe me? Well, no matter. I have ridden all over Kislev. I have fought the Northmen, and heard my tale from the mouth of one who saw her magic turn to the defense of the land. Do you know another?" The three men shared a look. "I know another," said Whisper. Okay, so this is now when we're going to start seeing the more destructive side of Mother Ostankya, I guess? Again, it's actually kind of interesting to see the psychology of Kislev here, where some might see her as a savior, others might see her as a total monster. It's pretty cool. It's very Warhammer. Again, why I like David Guymer so much. He knows the setting he writes for. The story I know is similar. There was indeed a battle fought at Struziv, and the Golden Knight was there, though only by chance, stopping in the Ropsals to eat the villagers' borscht and drink their vodka on his way south from some other campaign. It was a skirmish, nothing more. The North fights 100 battles just like that every summer, and Struziv would have gone unremembered had Tsar Boris's Golden Knight not been there. Put it down to the old Corsar's exaggerations. Your friend spoke briefly of the village hetman. He did not even mention his name, which would grieve him if he were alive. It was Maisko, Druzina Maisko of Struvich, and he is central to this tale. Maisko had 3 boys, Grigor, Evangi, and Radomir, and it was for them that Maisko had cancelled retreat. Not out of fear for their safety, you understand. The boys needed toughening up, and, in Maisko's opinion, a season in the wind would accomplish that nicely. None doubted that they would be great warriors one day, but this battle had come too soon. The Druzena raged at having his counsel ignored by some southern champion, but in private he relished the prospect of meeting certain doom alongside the legendary Golden Knight. For all his faults as a father and as a man, Macesko was Kislevite. And it was Macesko's sons lived, though many sons and daughters of Struziv did not. Pyres were lit for them, and many libations poured. Sacrifices were made to Dars, that his flames might carry their spirits to the great blue steppe, to ride forever past the horizon. Out of respect for their mourning, the Golden Knight and his rota consented to remain, but within the week they were gone. Back to the Boca Palace. Back to civilization. Your friend, Yuli, was right about one thing. This is Ostankya's land. And some weeks later, the hag mother returned to Struziv. She appeared as you described her, an old woman shuffling into the village, square with the aid of a stick. Her back bent almost to the ground under the weight of the wicker pannier on her back. The basket was filled with ornaments from the valleys and grisly trophies picked from the battlefield, polished stones, bits of stick, pretty feathers, horn skulls boiled in water, the stump of a cloven-hoofed leg, a spear sticking out blade up. The ordinary jostling with the macabre. Her tattered rags reeked of stewed nettles and stale cabbages. The skulls on top of her staff rattled with her step, as though the gods were rolling dice, settling the fates of men. As appalling as the hag must have looked to your Corsair friend, imagine the horror of finding her uninvited on your doorstep. Mother Ostankya rapped the butt of a stick on Macesko's door. Come out, she said aloud. You come when mother calls. Macesko was a prideful man, as we know. He did not want to look as though he was afraid of an old woman, but nor would he have his villagers think him the sort of man who came when his babushka called. He appeared at the balcony above her with an arrow nocked to his bow, and demanded to know the witch's business. Okay, so even the Druzinas, those ones who live in the steppes and not in the cities, they know to be scared of her. That's actually pretty cool. Because at the end of the day, she could be your savior or she could be your literal end. I kind of like that. Ostankya gave the Druzina an ugly smile. A life given for a life spared, she said. I spared 500 in saving Struziv from the beastmen, but ask only for 3 in return. Your sons. Send them out, and you need never again see me. What do you want with my sons? The old witch laughed, as one might over a fool's grave. All say they will be great warriors one day, and mother knows best how to care for her children. Mieszko, I'm pretty bad with these pronunciations, by the way, of course refused. He ordered his men to seize the unarmed hag, but the Corsairs feared Mother Ostankya more than their Druzina's temper. Cursing their cowardice, Mieszko loosed his arrow. It struck straight through Ostankya's heart. The villagers grasped in horror, but the old woman merely looked at the shaft quivering in her breast and cackled. It is said that Ostankya is not a creature of flesh and blood, but shaped by the old spirits from mud and grass, and the ground-up bones of dark things to be their queen. The true Queen of Kislev. Others may say different, but I tell you this is true, and all who saw her that day believed it. Dismissing the Druzina, she turned then to the gaping villagers. I'll have what's mine from Mieszko, or I'll have what's mine from you. This is why I'm getting confused with the pronunciation. There's loads of spelling mistakes with that word. It keeps switching. But yeah, she told them, deliver me, my children, and be spared your master's doom. With that, she folded her arms about herself and exploded in a flock of crowing black birds. The Druzina called for archers to shoot the cursed birds down, but none dared to move. Ostankya left Struziv in peace for a second time. None doubted she would be back. The next day, the baker's daughter went missing while collecting berries in the forest. She was a sweet girl and well-liked. The villagers grieved, but none suspected this was Ostankya's curse at work. The forest was dangerous, and she should not have been there alone. Winter is long, and come spring the wolves often need to be reminded to fear human iron. Really, the fault was with the parents, but then it was the tavern keeper's son, sent to the storeroom for a wheel of cheese, never to return. As the days went by, Struziv's children vanished one by one. Desperate parents took to hiding them in attics and cellars, standing watch at all hours. But always, come morning, one more from among the village's dwindling population of children would be gone. stolen away from behind locked doors like mist with the sunrise. The villagers appealed to their wise woman to avert the curse. In some places, they call these women hags or witches, but for all their herb lore and medicine, they have no real magic. There is only one hag in the woods, and her name is Ostankya. When the women's charms and potions failed, the villagers lynched her from a tree and burned her. No family was spared Ostankya's curse, except, it seemed, that of Druzina Mieszko. Remembering Ostankya's promise that whoever brought her children would be spared her curse. The villagers, who had fought so stoically against the Brayherds, now turned on each other. Okay, yeah, again, what I said in the previous chapter, previous page, some fear her, some revere her, some see her as just death, and others see her as the true Queen of Kislev. This is pretty cool. I like the story that is being implemented. But yeah, this is for certain. Baba Yaga has never existed now, and it's always been Mother Ostankya. Which, okay, it's easier to copyright. Why not? Had the Golden Knight stayed 1 month longer, he would have been appalled at what he saw. He might have even wondered if the beasts had not been the victors after all. If the victory Ostankya had given them was not an illusion of the notoriously tricksome hag. The Druzina's Izba was a stout, half-timber dwelling of 3 stories. The bottom floor is all stone. Mieszko and the few Kossars still loyal to him held out for days, fighting like rats to hold their own villagers at bay, until Mieszko's own maid cracked his skull open with an axe and tipped his body off the balcony. The villagers cheered as they hacked their former lord to pieces and set fire to the Izba. The boys were dragged out into the snow, barefoot and puffy-eyed from crying. Grigor, the eldest, fought until his knuckles were raw, and he was so exhausted that he could no longer walk, and had to be carried the rest of the way into the hills. Evni and Radomir went quietly. They were too young to understand what was happening, only that the immense, oftentimes frustrating force of nature they called father was now dead. The villagers blindfolded them so they could not find their way back, and led them deep into the wooded hills of the Ropsals as the villagers dared to go. There, calling out to Mother Ostankya that they had done as she had asked of them, they cut the children loose and fled to the smoking ruins of Struziv. And Ostankya was true to her word, after a fashion. No more children were taken for Struziv, though neither were any returned. And the following year, when Norskia from the west ventured into what would have been Brayherd territory, they found a village that had almost conquered itself. After the battle to dispose Mieszko, the villagers no longer had the resources to rebuild the walls they had destroyed, or to bring in the meager harvest that they had sown. The marauders burnt it to the ground in a single night of savagery and mounted the village's servant hells and spikes. It is said that Ostankya saw all from her house on the hill and was pleased. The most important lessons are often the hardest to learn. Yeah, okay, this makes sense. So what this was is they were doomed from the start. Had they probably given the sons, she would have come to help. But since they refused her, well, the Druzina refused her, but by extension all the villagers did, yeah, she wasn't going to help again. It's unfortunately a lesson that some people need to learn. But yeah. Radig fidgeted as the softly spoken woodsman finished his tale. He wanted to dismiss the lump in his stomach as his just dessert for eating and drinking too greedily. But it was not that. His hands itched and his innards squirmed as though he had forgotten something profoundly important. But the unconscious part of him, the flesh and the bone, remembered, and now sought by its own means to remind him. This talk of lost children brought a fuzzy but deeply unpleasant sensation. It conjured an image of a small dark-haired child running through tall grass, flapping her arms to frighten away birds from the recently sown fields. A girl who liked the color yellow, and who had woven it into the mane and tail of her father's horse so she could be with him when he rode. He saw himself in that image, a rough man, a callous man, a weathered man, kneeling before the simple shrine above his hearth and begging Dars for a boy. A strong, healthy boy who could inherit Radig's sword and ride in the rota when he was gone. He saw a dark-haired woman with exhaustion in her eyes. Her swollen belly showed through the homespun wooden smock she wore as she raised a limp hand in fear. And in memory he waved back, pretending it saddened him even half as much as it saddened her, clicking his tongue and shouting "Yah!" as he wheeled away and galloped after his rotor. He pressed his hand flat into his chest, but the ache was too deep for him to find. The memory shrank. By all the gods, how did I get here? What did I do? I think you scared him, said Axe, a smile creeping in his voice. He continued to work his blade with the whetstone. It was surely as sharp now as it would ever be, but still he worked at it, over and over and over. I think you're right, said Whisper. What? What happened to the 3 boys? Said Radig, unable to shake the suspicion that he already knew. The 3 pairs of eyes, so similar to one another, as green as the forest was dark, glittered around the campfire. And the other children who disappeared in the Ropsals. Axe shrugged. Some say they serve the Witch of Kislev still. That they, and others like them, fight alongside the spirits of the wild when she rouses the motherland to war. Or maybe it's just a story, said Whisper. Is it? Radig asked. Axe gave another shrug, another deeply buried smile pushing its way up through the heavy flaps of his bashlik, like a mole clearing away soil. I do not believe there is such evil in my land, Radig shook his head, as though that alone would be enough to keep such a belief from perching itself there. The Tsarina would not allow it. Whisper visibly sneered at that, but Radig went on. No, I won't believe it. He took a grip on his knees, as though meaning to unfold his legs and get up, to jump onto Kazia's back, and to find his way out of this cursed wood. But some fear he could not yet name held him in place. The skin on the back of his neck crawled, but he did not dare to turn around and look back at where Kazia stood, watching him. Okay, again, this is pretty much obvious that the 3 brothers are either going to be the 3 brothers from the Druzina, or they're going to be some face spirits attached to it. I'm liking the horror vibe here. Warhammer horror is something that doesn't really get explored a lot, but it definitely does bring in some really cool aspect that we didn't really get a lot in Warhammer Fantasy. Again, David Guymer, fantastic writer. Here, with the 3 woodsmen and their fire, he was safe. Out there. I knew a man at Struziv, he reminded them, his voice almost as low as Whisper's. Can any of you say the same? Can you? The 3 looked amused by the question. How could you have? Radig shouted at them, because when fear ignores all of a man's arrows, anger is always the last one in his quiver. You would have been little more than children. Would you rather hear a story from closer to home? Radig turned suddenly, as though struck, to the 3rd man, the silent man. He smiled at Radig, but there was no goodwill in his dark green eyes. But steel yourself, friend, for this one took place in this very wood. Druzina Witek was a pious man. He commissioned the building of a stone church, larger even than that in Bolgasgrad, and sponsored many priests to preach in his village. The Bear of Statlav, they called him, and not only for his huge stature and grisly temper when awoken before noon. He ate meat and fish at least once a week, as the strictures commanded, but never both on the same day. He bathed only out of doors. When rumors spread throughout the surrounding villages that a great black bear had moved into Statlav forest, Witek took it as a sign of Ursun's blessing. His priest demanded offerings of fish and berries to take deep into the woods, to the log cairn that stands as the Bear Father's shrine in Statlav, and for a time it appeared that Ursun truly had favoured Witek. Pilgrims travelled from Bolgasgrad, from Erengrad, from Prague, and even from the northern cities of the Empire where Ursun is worshipped, to spend their gold ducats in Witek's church and see their famous bear. But never once did it show itself, nor claim the offerings left for it at Ursun's shrine. And it was not long before the Bear Statlav became a joke to describe anything that was not as advertised. If your new stirrup broke or your milk was sour, it was common and guaranteed to find a sympathetic laugh, to blame it on the Bear of Stavslav. Stung by such mockery, Witek resolved to hunt the bear and kill it. No one would doubt his esteem with the father bear once it was stuffed and properly installed under the apse of his church, and the pilgrims and their gold would soon return. Now Urson allows such hunts so long as the proper respect is given. Dogs must never be used, nor bows or slings, though javelins are permitted. The bear must be slain in single combat and by hand, and prayers must be spoken afterwards. With a great entourage of priests and riders marshalled by a hawkish patriarch of the orthodoxy named Sowisa, Witek set off on his expedition into the woods. The hunt was led by a local man. Let us call him Kozel. He is the doomed hero of this tale, for while Witek was misguided and Sowisa was blinded by zealotry, Kozel should have known better. He was a horse archer, and had ridden from High Pass in the east to the Sea of Claws in the west in the servants of his Druzina. He had fought goblins in the World's Edge Mountains, and harried the Kaseak that raided from the north. Kozel knew his land and its legends, and knew that the black bears of Statlav, though descended from Urson, as all bears are marked by the Hag Mother. They are her servants, and guardians of the secret trails. And when Ostankya leads the men of Kislev to war, it's the bears they ride. Urson may allow for their killing, but the Witch of the Wood does not, and the murmurings of priests have no sway over her. One morning, on the hunt's departure, she came to Kozel with a warning. His pregnant wife jerked in her sleep and sat suddenly upright. Her eyes snapped open, but she was not awake. Her eyes were the glassy whites of the hag, and when she smiled, it showed the dimples of tiny tusks inside her mouth. "Come into the forest and Ostankya will get you," she said. Her voice was the rasp of wind through dried grass, and Kozel leapt out of bed and ran at once for Witek's Izba. In his terror, he ran headlong into Patriarch Srazia and repeated for him the hag's warning. The Patriarch struck him a stinging blow across the jaw that put Kozel on his knees, warning the horse archer against repeating such heresies in the presence of the Druzina, lest Kozel's wife and daughter be the next offerings for the bear of Staslav. There does seem to be a few inconsistent spelling here, which, as a dyslexic, it throws me off really badly. But yeah, let's continue. Overall, yeah, it's pretty interesting story, just kind of building it up, introducing loads of characters. Unfortunately, characters that we'll never really see in game or anything, but it's world building that needs to have new people involved. So he left an offering of rabbit and brushwood in the hope that this would appease the Hag Mother, and led Witek's expedition as he had agreed. He should have known better. Misfortune and woe followed the hunt thereafter. The weather turned against them. Rain made the going hard and miserable, as well as obscuring what spoor the Bear of Statlav might have left behind. Trees conspired to fall only across the hunters' favoured trails, driving them inexorably into darker and more dangerous reaches of the woods. A hunter broke his neck when the howl of a wolf spooked his horse into throwing him. A priest, unable to see where he was going, through the lashing rains, spilled over the edge of a ravine and fell into his death. Witek and Sowisa said prayers for them, but pressed on. The horses became difficult to manage, obliging the hunt to dismount and lead them, for they refused to bear their masters any further into the folly, and the laughter of the hag rustled through every brush, whispered like a secret from tree to tree. At last, the eager Kozel finally struck upon a likely trail, splayed footprints in the wet mud, so broad they could only have belonged to the Bear of Staslav. But, like all the pilgrims before him, Kozel would find no bear. A scream from the lead horse was the first warning of danger. The stallion kicked its hind legs at nothing, tipping sidewards and losing its rider, but somehow did not fall. Horse and man hung in mid-air, wriggling helplessly in a glistening net of sticky, silken webs. Two more riders walked into the same trap before they could stop themselves. Spiders the size of dogs swarmed down from the treetops to bind them in silk and ensure they never walked out again. Witek drew his sword and spurred his horse to attack, for his faith was genuine, and Sowisa and his priests were not for show. Their battle prayers sent fire coursing through the hunters' swords and filled their hearts with bloodlust, even as the stench of burning spiders made their stomach turn. The light of Dars seared away the rain and darkness, exposing the stealthy, moving things that had been creeping through the woods in ambush. There was something of the wolf about them, something of the bear, something of the old and wicked tree. Even revealed as they were, it was difficult for the hunters to distinguish them from the spruces and pines, for their skin was rough like tree bark. Their mangy fur was tangled in clumps of moss and dead leaves. They were as huge as trolls, but disturbed not a single pine needle with their steps. Beowulfs, things in the woods. Something about them drove men mad, some enchantment that had hardened warriors forgetting their weapons or gawking in horror when good sense would have had them fleeing for their lives. When they struck, it was with a fury that no natural beast could equal. Wittek bravely stood his ground and was the first to fall, torn to shreds by the Beowulf's monstrous claws. Urged on by example of their priests, the huntsmen fought with axe and bow, ripped apart one by one and devoured, or stung by the spiderlings and dragged off into the trees. And what of Kozol, you wondered? What of our poor, doomed hero? A Beowulf lunged across him to snatch up a chanting priest in its jaws. His pony reared in panic, but Kozol was a master horseman and a veteran of many battles. Controlling the animal with his knees, just barely holding onto his own wits in the face of such horror, he struck at the beast. I haven't read on, but I have a real sinking feeling that this guy, like the guy that we had from the beginning of the story, is Kozol. Honestly, again, very Warhammer horror. I'm loving this. I'm honestly loving this. His sabler chopped into the monster's shoulder, but its hide was tougher than leather, and the blow only angered the beast. His pony clattered back on to its front hooves, wrenching the sabler from his hand, for it was embedded in the monster's back and would not come free. Swinging its jaws toward Kozol, the Beowulf bit the struggling priest in half. Drenched in gore and half mad with terror, the pony buckled, and with Kozol reaching for his sabler, threw her rider from the saddle. His forehead hit the monster's hard shoulder, shattering the thoughts that had been swirling around in there, but his hand was already outstretched, and somehow it found the protruding handle of his sword. He caught hold of it as the monster set off after its frightened pony, and his face hit the monster's hard shoulder, breaking through the thoughts inside his head. Somehow his hand found the protruding... Oh, either this is a mistake, or it's just replaying in his head, so he's kind of living in some sort of purgatory right now. No! Radig pushed himself from the fire. He fell over in his panic, driving himself further on his back. He remembered it all now. The dying men, the screaming, mutilated horses, the blood sprayed across the impassive trees as mutated horror hoisted Wittek's horse off the ground and wrenched the struggling creature in half. The frantic chase through the woods. He sees now, Grigor. I think he does, Radomir. The three sons of Druzina Misetko smiled at him from behind their fire. Still on his back, Radig went for his sword. His hand closed over the emptiness behind his hip. The scabbard was empty. He remembered striking the sabler into the Beowulf's back, just as the Silent Man, or Grigor, as Radig now knew him to be called, had described it. No, no, no. He shook his head firmly. This was a nightmare. A terrible, terrible nightmare. His sword was not in his scabbard because it was in his saddle holster with his bow. Yes, that was it. He scrambled over onto all fours, knocking over pots and bowls and his own drying boots, kicking dirt over the fire as his wool socks skidded on the muddy, mulchy ground. Half running and half crawling, he scrabbled to where Kezia waited with her lead rein looped around a hanging pine branch. The pony's lips drew back, revealing large, sharp teeth. Radig's hand recoiled from her snarl. His heart lurched. It was not Kezia. The monster was 3 times as large as his pony, with a sloped back, and all its mass loaded onto its muscular front limbs, like a charging bear. Its head was brutally encased in bone, and a pair of grubby white tusks the size of sword blades erupting from its lower jaw. A wintry mane of reddish-brown fur and rotting leaves ran down its neck. There was no saddle. There was no holster for bow or sword. What he had taken for melted snow and lather was in fact the sticky wet blood of a butchered priest. The sword he had fought safely sheathed was sticking out of the monster's back. Harsh, inhuman laughter huffed from the brute's hard, bony nostrils, its eyes white and blind-seeming. But it saw him. He knew it, felt it in the knotting of his bowels, heard it in the horror screaming up at him from deep, deep inside his mind. Radek dropped to his knees, all his limbs failing him at once. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." "Boys are always sorry," said the voice in the smoke, the fourth figure around the fire that Radek had so very nearly seen. Even then, he dared not look at her. When they're caught. "Please," he thought of Sophia playing in the grass, Karistin waving him farewell. A tear welled up in his eye. It was the first time he had wept since he was a boy, when his pony had broken a leg on the frozen river, and his father had given him an axe and shown him what a man must do. He was Kislevite. Kislevites did not weep. He blinked the tear away. "You were warned against hunting bear in my wood," Ostankya hissed. "Many times and in many ways were you warned. What are you going to do with me?" "Now," said Evigny, right behind them now, "Mother Ostankya is going to get you." His axe, as Radigi Bregny had suspected, was very sharp. Overall, yeah, very cool, very nice lore dump introduction for the character and so on. A little bit disappointed this didn't really explain why a Chaos Creature is part of Kislev now. There's like no mention, like yes, we get some pretty cool intro, there's like really cool artwork, but again, no clarification. I will say, however, that I did like this as more proper context for the character, so we get to know her better. That's obviously very, very important, especially as she is new, you know, she's completely new. It needs to be done this way if you're going to introduce a character, because not only for Total War, but for Warhammer Fantasy in general, how are you going to find any interest in a character that you know nothing about, right? So I think this is pretty good. It's a pretty good read. David Guymer, again, fantastic author. I think I've said this like 5 times in the book. There's a bit of like spelling mistakes and so on, which kind of threw me off. It's really bad as a dyslexic. But yeah, overall, super cool. I really hope that we see more of this. But yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Let's start a bit of discussion. And I'll see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.